Private funds. Promoting private funds. All advertising and promotions for private funds must be to the unit holders, must be copied to the ESCA, and must clarify the private fund's specific nature and include the required disclaimers. Private funds must refrain from using public advertising medias. So you should advertise privately to private investors. Transferring of title to the private fund units. One wants to sell to another. Transferring title of a private fund's units are limited to the following. Transferring to existing unit holders. Remember, this is a private fund. This is not a public fund. That means it's not sold to the public. If I am an investor in a private fund and I want to, sell or exit, I have to sell it. I have to sell it to existing unit holders. I can also transfer it to another person, but there are limits because this is a private fund. So as an investor in a private fund, I can either sell to existing other investors in that fund. I can transfer it to a professional investor or a counterparty, as long as the value is not less than 180,000 dirhams. And I can transfer it to my family members or corporate person, 100% owned by a family member or in the family fund. So you see, there are restrictions. ESCA says you cannot transfer units in a private fund unless it's to another unit holder, or if it's a family fund to another family member, or if it's somebody outside the fund, you can transfer it to a professional investor as long as the minimum nominal value is at least 180,000 dirhams. Furthermore, units in a family fund must not be sold or pledged to a third party who is not a family member, or to corporate persons 100% owned by such party who is not a family member. That means family fund units should only be given to members of the family, whether they are natural persons or corporate persons. Now, private equity funds. Private equity funds are different from private funds. Private equity funds are funds that invest in private companies. So, for example, Tadawul Academy is a private company. A private equity fund invests in private companies. So, private equity funds are required to invest most of their assets in shares. You can invest in other asset classes like bonds or commodities, maybe, but it must be mostly in shares, because most of these private companies have shares. These shares will typically be in limited liability companies, limited partnerships, or private shareholding companies. So you need to invest in private companies with limited liabilities. However, private equity funds are also permitted to buy securities of public companies that have started the process of converting to private companies, or to commence a liquidation process. So as a private equity fund, you cannot invest in public companies unless these public companies have started the process of converting to private companies. Generally, these private equity companies, the fund manager of a private equity fund is called the general partner, because the fund manager is a partner with you in the fund. And you as an investor, you as a private equity investor, you are called a limited partner. So the general partner, which is the fund manager, this word general partner, you're going to see it in private equity funds. You're going to see it also in hedge funds. They call the fund manager the general partner, or the GP, and the LP. The general partner, the fund manager of the private equity fund, takes on a series of obligations, including calculating the net asset value, which is the value of every unit of that fund, the price of its units at the end of every 3 months. The assets should be valued according to international standards. The fund manager or the general partner should also perform more detailed valuation on the fund's assets at least once a year, based on the audited financials. Determine the borrowing percentages in compliance with the fund's investment policy, because most of these funds, they get their capital, yes, from their investors, but they can also get capital from borrowing. But there needs to be a limit on how much they can borrow, and that limit is indicated in the fund's investment policy. The fund manager, or the general partner, assumes full responsibility for the management of projects, investment decisions, and assets of the fund. Since he is the fund manager, obviously he's responsible for managing the fund. The next type of fund are called venture capital funds. Venture means risky. Venture capital usually invests in startups. Now, private equity funds usually invest in established companies, growing companies. Venture capital funds usually invest in startups. So a venture capital fund is a private investment fund that invests in high-risk assets such as new projects, modern technologies, distressed projects, or companies with new creative ideas or technologies. Startups or companies that need the capital. In addition to the regulations for investment funds, the following conditions must be satisfied by a venture capital fund. So a venture capital fund, because it invests in risky assets, it needs to meet the regulations of investment funds plus additional regulations. What are these additional regulations? Invest at least 70% of its assets in one of the following. Units of other venture capital funds, provided that the investments of such funds is not more than 10% of their assets in other venture capital funds. So a venture capital fund can invest in other venture capital funds as long as these other venture capital funds do not have more than 10% of their assets in other venture capital funds. The second requirement is one or more equity instruments issued by companies not listed in the regulated primary market by such companies. That means they cannot invest usually in public companies. They have to invest in private companies, not listed. They can lend money to unlisted companies, that's fine, provided that such lending is not more than 30% of the fund's assets. So as a venture capital fund, instead of investing in startups' shares, you can lend money to startups, as long as you do not lend more than 30% of your fund. You can lend money to new or distressed projects, provided that such lending is not more than 30% of your fund's assets. Or the fund may become a partner in such projects. That means if you lend more than 30%, you should own a piece of that company. So ESCA is allowing you to lend to startups. But if you're going to lend more than 30% of your investments, you should own a part of that startup. Venture capital funds investments which would be permitted for public investment fund must not exceed 30% of its assets. So they do allow investing in the public, but it needs to be a public investment fund, and it should not be more than 30% of your assets. So you can see that 30% is something that you have to keep in mind, right? When it comes to venture capital funds. There are additional requirements based on the total value of the assets held by the venture capital fund. Okay, the venture capital fund with managed assets that are valued at 180 million or more must prepare their financial according to the IFRS, have a risk manager, and do not exceed their net asset value do not exceed its net asset value in its total exposures to risk. That means do not take more risk than the value of your fund. Do not expose yourself to risks that are of higher value than your fund. Now, if your managed assets are less than 180 million, then you must prepare a summary of the annual report in accordance with the IFRS and not exceed your net asset value in total exposures to risk. That means your risk should not be more than your net asset value of your fund. That means no need for risk manager. And you notice here I prepare a summary. You don't need to prepare you need to prepare an annual report and a summary. But I think the area that CISI concentrates on is the need for a risk manager. I think I remember this. If you are a venture capital and your fund is worth more than 180 million, you need a risk manager. If your fund is worth less than 180 million, you don't need a risk manager. So that's venture capital funds. Now let's look at general and limited liability partnership funds, which is very broadly speaking, notice I'm using the word broadly. So what do we mean by hedge funds? So now remember, private equity can also use this model of general and limited partnership funds. Just keep that in mind. A general and limited partnership fund, GPLP, is an investment fund with a fixed capital formed in UAE that has general partners who are the fund managers and limited partners who are the investors with a partnership agreement between them. Because usually in the case of hedge funds, the fund manager, who is the general partner, he gets a cut. He gets the management fee and he gets a cut from the profits. The general partner must be a firm licensed by ESCA, obviously. The limited partners can be natural persons or corporate persons. They can be human beings or they can be companies. That's fine. Capable of the management, follow-up, and protection of their own investments. And they can include the following. So your investors can be governments. They can be pension funds. They can be international agencies like the World Bank, for example. They can be persons licensed to exercise commercial business. They can be companies. Or they can be individuals. But if they are individuals, then they must have solvency and declare that the annual income is not less than 3 million. So if you're going to attract individual investors, they need to have an annual income of at least 3 million. And they need to have net equity rights of at least 70 million. Sorry, they can either have an annual income of at least 3 million or equity of at least 7 million. You should not consider their house as part of the equity. Now, of course, they should also declare that they have sufficient knowledge and experience on whether or not they are using a financial advisor. So hedge funds, which in this case we're calling general and limited liability partnership funds, they can attract governments, officials, official institutions, companies, and individuals. But individuals need to have an income of at least 3 million or a net equity, excluding their house, of 7 million. Continuing with these general and limited partnerships, the general partner is fully liable for the fund's obligation because he is the fund manager. If there are multiple general partners, multiple fund managers, they are jointly liable. The limited partners, who are the investors, are only liable to the extent of their share in the capital fund because they are limited partners. The license application of the fund is submitted to ESCA by the general partner or the representative, excluding any limited partner, enclosing the supporting documents. So who submits the application is the fund manager who's going to manage the fund, the general partner. So it will include the following: name, date, headquarters, trade name, nationality, date of birth of each limited partner. So we need the name and incorporation of the general partner and the name, nationality, date of birth, incorporation, blah, 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 of the limited partners. The name of the fund with the phrase GPLP fund at the end, the place and address of the fund, company of the partnership, a copy of the partnership agreement, declaration signed by the general partner confirming the payment of the required capital, and of course, any other information. Yes, you need to memorize these. What are the requirements of a general and limited partnership fund? The fund's license term will be 1 year, expiring on 31 December. The first license will be issued until the end of December, and then it will be renewed starting January. And you need to submit your renewal requirements, renewal needs at least 1 month before the expiration of the license. And of course, pay the fee for it. The general partner must also notify ESCA within 7 days of the following: if you've changed your location of business, if you've changed any of your general or limited partners, and if any general partner becomes limited partner, or if any limited partner becomes a general partner. You need to notify ESCA within 7 days. Remember, for those of you who are subscribed on the portal, you can go to the section called Exam review highlights, and you can see all of these reminders that we have summarized for you to go through before you go for the exam.